This is House Planning Help, episode 369. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to build new or to retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Toby Diggens. It's actually a part 2, so if you haven't heard part 1, reverse back an episode. Last time we talked about his work around natural landscapes and encouraging biodiversity. In this session, we're looking at his barn conversion, which is taking on the Living Building Challenge. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I thought Living Building Challenge, it's all about lovely materials and understanding so much about the materials that we're using. The thing that sticks out for me is always the red list. What can we avoid here? But one organisation that I'm a big fan of and thought this would be a useful resource to tie in here is the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. All sorts of useful information on their website, and it's a good time of year to be mentioning this because this is when they gear up for their awards for the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo. So we'll tie in that website, but just covering things like might be natural fibres, it could be paints and finishes, how you reduce plastics on a project, EPDs, if you don't even know what those letters stand for, well, that's another big one, isn't it? Reuse, all of those themes. And we're going to feature a few episodes from some of their members as we get close to the conference this year. So let's get to our featured interview with Toby Diggens from Dig & Co. This is focusing on the Living Building Challenge. And I started by asking Toby when he first thought about taking on his barn conversion.
So it was back in the early stages of 2018, I would have said. I was at the time not married to Bella, my wife, and we were getting married in the summer of 2018. And I think we returned from the wedding and honeymoon and kind of started asking ourselves the question, what should we do next? At the time, we were living in the Cotswolds and we wanted to work on the land in some way. At the time, my mission was to have a small patch of land that maybe had a sort of resilient, ecologically focused plant nursery on it, for example. And there was this redundant barn on Bella's family farm, which they had been looking to do something with for quite a long time. In fact, the owners before had put in for planning permission for it to turn into some holiday lets, but it had been refused. I think pretty much after just a conversation, one breakfast, just after we got back from the honeymoon, Bella's mum and dad were like, well, you could always renovate the barn. And we sort of laughed it off a little bit and said, oh, well, we're more likely to want to go to South Devon. And then about 20 minutes later, we're like, that's a great idea. Let's do it. Of course, completely not knowing what you're getting yourself in for, the ball started rolling with things like ecological surveys and structural surveys. And it was at that time that I met Martin Brown, who was sort of ambassador for the Living Buildings Challenge in Bristol. And he told me about the Living Buildings Challenge, which also at the same time I'd been researching because of doing a master's in ecological urban design and how the Living Building Challenge could fit in. So all of a sudden things started coalescing, and by the end of 2018 we were self-preparing our own planning application to go in.
So because this was an existing building, does that add any layers of complication to the Living Building Challenge?
I suppose to some extent it does, because there are a set of relatively scrutinised sort of insulation and generally acceptable sort of principles that one tries to achieve with modern ecological buildings. I think the thing that attracted us to the Living Building Challenge more than going for a passive house system or something like BREEAM, for example, was that there was a lot of flexibility and arguing your case in the Living Buildings Challenge. As we went through the handbook, we realised that if you could make the argument for why you'd chosen to do a particular detail or buy a particular product, then actually it might be looked upon as not the right decision, but you had the chance to argue your point. So yeah, that's, I think, why we ended up going for that. I think the other thing with regards to Living Building Challenge that was really powerful is that they were inserting in the petal system these ideas of beauty, for example, and the kind of the space that you're living within. Whereas a lot of the other environmentally conscious building accreditation systems were just looking at the kind of technology and science of the building.
We've had Martin on the podcast before, so he's gone in depth, and I've visited one of the sites, Quairden Valley Park. So we know a bit about it, but maybe you could just give us a quick recap.
Okay, so the Living Building Challenge is a holistic building framework where you are looking to create a building which, to some extent, excuse the pun, is living, is as closely tied to its ecosystem and surroundings as you physically can make it. And that goes from your material choices, of which there's a red list that you can't use. If you do use, then essentially it's a big black mark against getting the accreditation. But at the same time, there are elements in it like offsetting. So as an example, with the fact that this was an already existing building, we won't need to provide as much of an offset. But the idea is that you give within, it's quite complicated, but there are certain kind of zones within which you do living buildings, and we're out in the sort of rural farmland zone, which is one away from the kind of wilderness. And when you're in our zone, you do have to sort of offset the space that you're developing if you were building a brand new building with an area that is dedicated to kind of ecological restoration. So the depth that the Living Building Challenge goes is to be not just about delivering a slightly more sustainable building than traditional building techniques. It's about, I think they say, what does really good look like? So you have considered how that building exists in its ecosystem and have then tried to make it positive to that ecosystem rather than just neutral or negative.
That's one of my favourite things about it, that's a good way of thinking, isn't it? Because you can immediately think, how can I minimise the damage I'm doing in this location, which is the opposite. So
yeah, exactly.
Were you in any way concerned that you didn't have a massive amount of examples to draw upon?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Invariably, within more natural and indigenous building, there are a huge quantity of the massive wealth of information and inspiration that comes from when we made dwellings out of the land that we wanted to inhabit, as it were, or stay. The interesting thing is then fast forwarding traditional indigenous building techniques into a world where we need to hit building regulations and much more complex requirements of buildings than when it was just a shelter to stop the wind and the rain. But I think the lovely thing is that we held to those old logics with this project really well, and then utilized, for example, I know you know Chris Brookman from Back to Earth. We utilized these emerging and actually in some cases quite well established traditional building techniques to get us there. And then sometimes you do have to make a little bit of a sacrifice on space because the natural insulations, certainly when we put them in, weren't quite as effective in terms of depth. You can get more insulation in terms of U value out of your PIR board, but that was off the table. We didn't want a fossil fuel based insulation system because we also needed a breathable building because we had a building fabric which required it already. And so we're sort of pushed to some extent by the building to deliver a really ecological project because that was only going to support the main superstructure better. But at the same time, with the Living Building Challenge added in, it spurs you on to think about all the details and think about recycling as much as we could, that came out of the building, blah, blah, blah. So it's a really cool way of looking at how to design and build.
You mentioned that they had tried to get planning for the barn before. So Was the Living Building Challenge a big help in getting planning permission, or did you just approach it in a different way?
I think it definitely allowed for us to tell a really positive and powerful story to the planners about the impetus and emphasis that we were going to put on how this was going to be restored. And I think the other thing which played into our hands was that it wasn't a holiday let. For example, it was going to be a place that we lived and we worked and we ran the farm, for example. And that, I think, had a big amount of resonance in this quite rural, quite dislocated landscape, as it were. Like the overall quantity of commercial activities where we live is quite low. And we would have become another commuter going to Exeter if we hadn't had this desire to actually live and work here, which of course has then allowed for us to create a community to some extent around the work that I do, which, you know, supports the farming and supports everybody's happiness, etc. So I think overall it was always quite a powerful narrative for this project, and I think that, you know, that allowed us to get the planning.
What did you actually want from the house when you sat down and did the brief? We know your background, it's going to be ecological, but what else did you want to include in the house or from the house?
I think what we wanted to do was firstly kind of almost let the house decide in terms of space. So the space creation was going to be defined by the best bits of the house, as it were, and to not be too prescriptive about what we necessarily wanted. So much to say, you looked on Pinterest and saw a cool kitchen, like that's what we've got to have just because, but we wanted the building and the way that it looked and sat in the landscape to define that for us. We did definitely want a very open way of living. And I think you've seen that from looking around as I trying desperately to find somewhere quiet to do the recording. And there's almost nowhere because everywhere's really open.
Do you have a door anywhere?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I always had the thought about how nice it is to be able to sort of be in the bath and also have guests and friends and be able to talk to them from the bath, you know, rather than just have to go to have a bath somewhere else in the house. And then, you know, we've got dogs and there's lots of young children and everything. And actually just being able to see everything going on, as much as it means that there's probably a slight lack of privacy, just that isn't our way of being. We just like having the ability to be conversational almost anywhere. And so that, I think, was a huge consideration. And then one of the principal design features that you saw as you came in was that glazed atrium. And I've always dreamt about having the ability to have somewhere in a house that has a glazed area big enough to kind of grow plants in a house, because I feel that they're so important to our well-being, as it were. And as a consequence, we were able to deliver that because the barn atmosphere allows for a lot of those kind of double height spaces. The atrium is where the two big barn doors were. So essentially you've got this big glazed core. And that was something that essentially jumped out at us as soon as we started putting pen to paper.
So does this touch on biophilic design?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm hugely inspired by Edward Wilson, who was the guy that coined the phrase biophilia, you know, that sort of innate requirement to tap into our natural selves. And the Living Building Challenge also references biophilia throughout its literature. And I think because we're coming from a landscape perspective, biophilia was going to be an integral and absolute part of the design process. And biophilia doesn't necessarily just mean putting plants in a house. It means designing as if your environment is your outdoor environment. So what things in biophilia stimulate a better and more enhanced living environment for a person? Distances away from things and how the flow of a place works is actually all calming to somebody as much as it is functional. Function, obviously, when it's done right, is very aesthetic because it makes you feel right about the surroundings you're in. So that's biophilia as well.
How did the design develop then? Because we know it's going to have lots of wonderful materials in it, but how are you doing this by yourself? Are you bringing in a team?
So Bella and I designed the barn ourselves, and, you know, having that sort of landscape architectural background, I drew it up and got all of the plans ready for planning, which meant that we had total control over the design process. There was some iterations that we had to make when we realized that it was going to be, you know, curtilage listed, which was a thing to consider. And then that did change the design, we think, very much for the better. It opened up the living end where the kitchen is even more than it was before, which was a wonderful iteration to the design, which we hadn't expected. So that was quite nice, where a seemingly negative addition to having to, go through the rigmaroles of doing a listed building application actually ended up meaning a better design, we think, for the end result, which is quite cool. And then we kind of got together the building team. We had a great structural engineer and basically laid out the stall that it was going to be a very ecological building and that we weren't really going to, there was no quarter to kind of cutting corners. So when one of the walls fell down, we rebuilt it in the stone that it fell out of. Of course, most people would just skin up a load of concrete block and then face it up with stone. But we were like, right, we want this to be rebuilt as it was built. So I remember our builder, Steve, looking at us was like, you want what? And then, of course, 5 days later after we finished, there he was photographing it. It was like the most proud he'd ever been of a stone wall because he hadn't been told to do it in block work. And so the whole way through the journey of that build process, it was about controlling the narrative of why we were doing it and how. The materials choice, as you touched on, was actually almost quite simplified by the logic of locally sourced from the farm. We knew at the time there were, lots of ash woods being taken down because of ash dieback. They're being cut down still today to try and get ahead of the dieback, destroying the fabric of the wood. And ash is a gorgeous wood, so there's ash everywhere because it's a beautiful, beautiful wood, native hardwood. We've got great friends who have a company based around native hardwood flooring and timber, and they helped us get it all milled up. And so walking around the barn, you see oak, you see ash. Those are the two trees you see in most of the woodlands around here. And then you see cob and you see stone. So it's that close tie to place, which we always wanted to make sure was maintaining the building's kind of natural position in the landscape.
We haven't really talked about cost.
Yeah.
And I know when we start using lovely materials, I'd love to say it's always the cheapest, but it's not. So how are you keeping track on cost and knowing what you can do, or are you trying to do as much as you can with what's around you first?
Yeah. I mean, we saved on cost hugely by doing a massive amount of the work ourselves. I mean, Bells and I say often that we think we built 30% of this barn with our own hands, and then the rest was done by others, but we were project managing it. So we were able, because of that, I sort of speculate that we saved about 100,000 in labour and project management fees because of doing so much of it ourselves. The barn itself, the main principal building, came in at about 280,000 in 2020 when we built it, 2020, 2021, which you'd never do now because of inflation. We subsequently built the additional studio for about 125. And that, again, was because we knew about simplified building materials. Like we did that in timber, basically. And we recycled all of the concrete to do our own gabe-in basket concrete filled foundation. So we didn't need any additional concrete. And so it's just sort of using those hacks to try and keep the costs down, not being too aggressive about timescales, because if you're really hardcore on your timescales, the cost goes up all the time because you're needing to put more people or more materials on into the job quicker. And I think, speed, especially with a job like this, would have ended up meaning we made worse decisions, because you sometimes with these old barns need to kind of see a design emerging and then go, okay, next layer. All right, yeah, that's going to work, rather than forcing something on an old building. Cost was definitely managed rigorously by two things. One, us doing a lot of work, and B, the other thing was coming back to the cost spreadsheet in 3 or 4 key moments of the build and analysing where overspends had been done in major stages, and then having to make design decisions which may not have been our principal design decisions but were essentially cost-focused design decisions. And if you have the time behind seeing the finances and going, okay, we don't have what we thought we had for this particular arm of the budget, you actually can design a great solution rather than just see it as a problem. And that's what I have always really got out of this process, is there is never one way to finish a project. There are loads and loads of ways around problems. You just need the headspace and the knowledge of your sort of budgetary requirements to make sure that you can design through those requirements, and that's what we did.
And were there any challenges in terms of, I think you have to avoid plastics and, or is it just getting one of these penalties and not too many penalties? How does that work?
Yeah, well, we were really rigorous about not using things like plastics or anything on the red list. I mean, the only step down from the nirvana of being completely ecological was that we realised that we had to use an EPS floated concrete raft for the floor, because a suspended timber floor with natural insulation in it was going to decrease the overall volume of the internal space to such a degree that the sort of upstairs mezzanines would have been very difficult for me, quite tall, to live in. And so we did put EPS under the floor. I mean, luckily EPS versus PIR should theoretically be sustainable. We then used the recycled fly ash concrete, Regen 6 concrete, for the raft rather than using virgin concrete, which was the sort of mitigation. And then in almost all other scenarios, we tried as best possible to reuse as many offcuts and scraps as possible to make design details, really brief the team on saying, if you're milling up pieces of timber and if you've got a foot or more, that goes into a bin that could be used for something else. And then details emerged out of having those trash bins, as most people would see them, but they were resources to us, because especially if it was like ash or oak, it's like you're going to use it at some point, even if you use it as a piece of battening. So that was a huge consideration. And I think, again, will have saved inordinate amounts of money. It seems frustrating at the time because you don't have perfectly milled timber stacked up next to you. But actually, when you then finish whatever that detail is, you look at it and you're like, I can't believe we made something out of what looked like a heap of junk. So that was a massive amount of work to consistently keep people on the straight and narrow of, but then ends up having this like really satisfying feeling when you move into the barn and you're like, I can't believe we got so far with so little. And that's a testament to carrying that along and amazing how much you can use out of what one might nowadays perceive as waste.
Did you monitor how much waste you had coming out of the project?
We started by doing that, I would say.
And then thought we got other things to concentrate on.
Yeah. But one quite cool fact is that so much of it was built with natural materials that even though it's probably not the best thing to do, we'd have the occasional bonfire for those offcuts of wood or use scraps for log burners and stuff. And we never hired a skip, which I thought was a pretty amazing achievement. We did recycle almost all of the plastic wrapping, which the insulation and other materials that arrived on site arrived in, because luckily around us, being in the farmed landscape, a lot of silage wrap can be taken to one of the local farming department stores, as it were, like Mole Valley, and as a consequence, they recycle that kind of wrap. So we were able to hugely mitigate waste. I mean, incredibly so, to be honest. And with it being a working farm, if there were some offcuts, we'd often store them up and then, they might be used to repair a shed or something. And we had this enormous stack of pallets. And luckily, again, from the perspective of farming, we store hay every winter and we put down a floor of pallets now, which ventilates the hay better. So just using up whatever we could, really.
In terms of reclaimed materials, so we talked about incorporating some, but were there any that you brought to the project thinking this will be useful?
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of limestone paving that's in the back hall to the house, which came from a landscaping project. So that was useful. I kept that in reserve in the garage for ages, thinking like one day I'll use this. And my mum had actually done a floor in the bathroom at home in Norfolk, where I was brought up. And similarly, we used her marmoleum tiles for that. So that was quite nice. Agricultural doors, which came off the barn, went back into the barn. I mean, one of the design details we needed to achieve for the listed building consent was to have some of the old doors still rehung. So I would say the majority of the recycling was from the barn's materials. And actually, the barn was set up for electrics. It was fully plumbed in, as it were, electrically prior to us starting the conversion. We even stripped out all of the sockets and boards and reused those for the project. So we were pretty ruthless about making sure that if there was something that could go in, and you can see one of the light fittings there, they only look like that because that is the agricultural light fitting that the barn started with. So we did have to buy a few more of them, but we had maybe 15 double plug 2-gang sockets that we just immediately reinstalled. So there's a huge amount of reworking for sure.
What else have you got to tick off on the living building challenge? I may have this wrong, but do you have to be able to look after all of your means on site? Is that one of the...
Yeah. So, well, energy wise, you have to produce 105% of your energy, or at least when we did the job, it was that. And then wastewater treatment and your drinking water all needs to be kind of dealt with. So we still haven't quite achieved the drinking water thing, just purely because what we need to do is put in a big sunken tank that catches our rainwater off the roof that then goes through a UV filter and then comes back through the building. We haven't quite got to that yet.
So are you using mains water at the moment? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, exactly.
And how do you feel about, I mean, does that make sense to continue on with that, or you do it just for the certification?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, there is a nice thought about having treated but not regionally treated water. And, it wouldn't have things like fluoride in it, which I think the water companies now put in. So there are some potential health benefits long term that would come from having your own natural water system. I mean, the water in the southwest where we are is amazingly soft, which is great. But obviously the mains was just there when we did the job. It's one of those funny things where money, no object, I'd do it overnight, but it's another £20,000 to put in, if not more. And you can go as big or as small as you want in terms of the tank size. You're never not going to be on the mains, because the way that system works is that you have a top-up system that when the tank gets lower than a quarter, the mains starts feeding into the tank, A, to keep the tank clean because it can get full of bugs if it's left stagnant for too long. But also, with drought periods, you do, just with the general use of a house, kind of burn through water quite quickly. I mean, we're really sensitive about water, like, share baths and stuff, and tend to try and absolutely overstack the dishwasher if we're using it. So we try and keep water use to a minimum. But yeah, I think if we were being kind of held at gunpoint in terms of getting the accreditation, we'd have to do it. But you can get Petals certified and not get a Living Building Challenge certification, and probably we would fail on water, as it were. So yeah. But I mean, in terms of energy, we have a 6.5 kilowatt solar system on one of the barns next door, and then we have a Tesla battery which backs up our energy use at night. We run an induction hob, and we have solar hot water, as it were. So whenever there's excess power, it dumps solar energy into the hot water tank. So the system's very simple. And then the underfloor heating, which we have, hardly ever comes on because of how insulated the house is. So in terms of overall energy use, it's very low, I think.
How are you heating the house?
Well, we have electric underfloor, with sort of infrared electric underfloor, and then we have one single log burner in the middle of the living room, and that does it.
So log burner. Now, how do you feel about this? I've been on quite a journey over the years. My wife convinced me, or tried to get me to put in a log burner, but I was against it. So what are you thinking about that? Well,
yeah, massive traditionalist, I suppose. I grew up in a farmhouse in Norfolk, 3 log burners. The kind of craft of running the log burners and getting the wood in and chopping the wood every autumn, that's in my psyche so much that I'd hate to not have one. From a purely selfish perspective, I love that process of August and into September, preparing the wood and stacking it and knowing you've got what you need. That ties us very closely to how we manage our woodlands on coppice rotations, and when we lay hedges, we'll use the wood to burn. We're in a very unpopulated area, so of course, from a particulate pollution perspective, relatively it's far less damaging than if we were in an urban scenario. And I question the overall ecological requirements of more technologically advanced energy systems in terms of if you have a sustainable use of wood close by and you're in a rural landscape, which actually I think is the Living Building Challenge's stance on it, because a log burner is allowed. It might not be in new handbooks, but certainly when we did ours in our zone 4 or zone 3, the rural landscape, log burners weren't out of the question. Whereas if you're in the urban area, then they're definitely out of the question. So it is a complex question to answer. And I think certainly as one becomes more densely populated, they are having that negative effect on health that everybody talks about. So yeah, we have one.
But you're not concerned about particular inside the house and air quality?
Not really, no.
Not really.
No.
Let's move on to energy performance then. Sitting behind us, we've got a triple glazed window. You've talked about insulation. So is there an as-built check for the performance? What's built into the Living Building Challenge there?
Yeah, so we have to tell them what has been done in terms of energy use over a year. And we need to also do an air tightness test still for that. So there are a few things that we still need to tick off in terms of getting the accreditation. But yeah, generally it's about submitting the energy use and sort of attributing that to the quantity of insulation that's gone in. So when you send in all the sort of design details, you show the thicknesses of the insulation in the walls and the construction. And then that obviously can be run through a kind of program that tells you the thermal performing capabilities of that design detail. So yeah, that's how we do it.
What's been the biggest challenge of the project?
Certainly keeping the costs under control. Like you were saying earlier, with the requirement to try and stay on message of these ecological products, you can get caught in a bit of a ecological price trap. So really trying to make the right investments where we needed them in terms of buying the products that we had to get from more constructed ecological methods, but then offsetting that by using natural materials that were close at hand to reduce the cost somewhere else was vital. When we first started, the biggest challenge was seeing so much of the building fall down because it had been kind of tightened up with a new roof about 5 years before we started. Prior to that, the walls literally were just splitting. And it had probably kept it alive, this building, for another 5 years past what would have been almost total dereliction. When we started to unpick the fabric, it was like we walked to the corner of one place and we started to pick the mortar out and then the wall falls down. And then we take the roof off and the entire cob front wall just falls down. We got woken up one morning by a early delivery. The guy had come in at 6 from somewhere quite far away, and he knocked on the door. We were living down in the farmhouse at the bottom with my parents-in-law, and he was like, had a bit of a collapse overnight. And I was like, oh no, not again. And we went up, and the entire front wall gone. And it just felt like we were just going backwards for so long. And then to compound that, we have this interminably wet winter, which started at the end of October. And at that point, we were pointing all the stonework. And it was a case of arrive on site with the guys at sort of 7:38, spend an hour uncovering semi-wet pointing, get a mix on, go up, point a metre squared before the rain comes in, cover it all up again, and this snail's pace all the way through until basically the end of November 2019 led me to think, are we ever going to get anywhere? Because there's no structure at that point. It's just a few walls here and there, a floor, and that was it. That was hard. And we didn't start building again until March, just purely because the weather, because it was all outdoor work, was so bad. And then, of course, COVID hit pretty much in the days that we were just uncovering the barn after sheeting it all down. Finally, the sun came out, and then it was like the world shut down. And I mean, in a strange way for us, it ended up looking back on it as being strangely positive because my work was beginning to explode. We had lots going on, and then everything shut down, and we had this clarity which allowed us to just work on the barn. And actually, contractors who had left us in November in this sort of awful state of not much being done, actually a huge amount had been done, it just didn't look like it. We then suddenly were getting calls from them. Oh, you've got a nice building site in the middle of nowhere where we can be safely socially distanced. Do you mind if we come back? I was like, I don't think I've ever been called by a contractor to come back to work. So I was like, definitely. So all of a sudden we had 2 or 3 groups, some outdoors doing landscaping work, some doing stonework, and then the timber framers all arriving, and all of a sudden the barn was being built.
It's not the first time I've heard that, and there is a strong driver to leave the house sometimes and the family. I've had enough.
Yeah,
need to get to work.
Well, that was it. Yeah, exactly. So we unknowingly took advantage of that, and we really sped up through 2020 because of that. And then were able, thankfully, to move in at the end of the year. So it was remarkably quick to some extent, considering what we started with.
And you've really kept a lot of the character. I know in those early days, stripping back, you're saying it was a challenge, but are there any tips on how you did that?
So I think with some of those characterful elements, like there's a beautiful central stone wall that's exposed on both sides that divides the house in two. We just knew from the beginning that had to be retained. And so we knew that we were going to have our work cut out to just make that a beautiful feature. And invariably, we kind of used an opening which was already there as a strange half-height opening with a nice oak lintel that's about 12 foot off the ground. And we were looking at how to break holes in this wall to make the door, and suddenly we looked at that and we were like, well, that could just be the door. So now we've got a 12-foot high door, because it made more sense not to fiddle with the fabric and have another collapse, which was probable, and actually just use the lintels that were already there. So there were certain things that we stayed really true to the whole way through the build. And I would say that with conversions, and I've only done one and worked on a couple as a designer, is that actually having some foresight to those bigger pieces does just then sort of form up the rest of the design around them. So yeah, that's how I would see that.
What have you learnt from doing this?
God, so much. One of the most important things that I've learned is that in construction, momentum is everything. If you lose momentum at any point during a build project, it is unbelievably difficult to regain it. You can, but as the client and keeper of the purse strings, etc., it's painfully slow as you're revamping that momentum. So what I learned was that you've got to just, if you're project managing a job, be just ruthless at keeping stuff arriving and keeping people engaged, keeping people on site doing jobs that are getting you somewhere, and making sure that there is jobs ahead of jobs, and that you don't turn up on site after going to pick up a load of insulation and half the team sitting there being like, what do we do next? So keeping people really well briefed, making sure they've got the right drawings in front of them, answering questions about any queries that they have about those details, and making sure that they've got the right tools and the right people around them to actually be doing the job, not clearing up or fiddling around somewhere else, but actually doing the work that's there. That's a huge part. And then project management wise, for sure, the key thing is to never get too carried away in the project without knowing that the sum of the project's parts needs a bit of attention the whole way through the process. So you do need to return to your budget every couple of months and really look through, like, where did we overspend? If we did, how are we going to save that here to keep the costs to a point where you're not mortgaging and remortgaging and getting loans and credit card stuff? Because I think a lot of people can get caught up in the ideal finish, and going so for broke for that perfect finish will often drive you into a lot of additional cost. And the other thing is being quite happy to not turn around. So sometimes you'll go back to the project after having to have some time away for work or whatever as a project manager, and a detail will have been completed that you're not happy with. It happens on every project. up and down the country every single day. The question you have to ask yourself is, A, can I live with that detail? Because if it's not mission critical, is it something that I want to reverse at cost? Or if it is something I can't live with, how do I design something around it and within it that means that when I look at the overall vista, I don't look at that awful piece of work? You know, if it's structural, obviously you have to be very conscious of the fact that that could be seriously limiting in the long term. But when it comes to more internal, nice final finishes, we found with this that a little bit of time, let the anger go down, let the frustration at the fact that you might need to do something again subside, and then start thinking, all right, this has been done. Is it as important as I felt when I first got in? No. Okay, great. Let's actually put this there, put that there. And then by the time we've finished, we're hardly going to see it. Crack on. So that's what I would say.
What has it been like as a home?
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, I literally said last night when I got in from work, I just feel so lucky to live here. It is just super, super special. And there's very little else I can put to that. Like it's super rare to be able to do this. It's probably rarer still to be able to do it. You know, at my age, I'm like 36. And then to be able to live and work with the vision that we had those years ago is a very, very special thing. And I just feel so incredibly lucky to have been able to do it.
And finally, what does it mean for the Living Building Challenge? Are you first stop on that journey these days of people wanting to research? Have you had any calls for advice, or is it growing?
I don't know. I think cost pressure during that rapid acceleration of inflation after COVID probably did have a bit of a negative impact on the Living Building Challenge, because you know, the word is out that it's more expensive to do ecological buildings. I wouldn't necessarily argue that point forever. I don't think that's true. It's about how you approach doing building projects and how you adjust to make sure they stay in budget, I think, more importantly than just because you're going environmental, they're just more expensive. That's a bit of a red herring. I think the Living Building Challenge is a wonderful concept, and we still have some things to do with regards to getting it accredited here. I think that it probably suits bigger projects where there's more resource on the overall project management and kind of scrutinizing and accreditation side, which I think is very hard for people who are just doing their own self-builds to really have that much care about, because all they want to do is get into their houses and start living out of the scenario which they're probably in, which is like a caravan or jumping around rentals or living with parents or whatever, which is seriously hard wearing on one's psyche from any angle. You know, and I know lots of friends who've done their own self-builds. I know, you know, one of my best friend's parents, they lived in a caravan for nearly 7 years while he self-built his own house by himself. You know, those caravans are like leaking by the end. You know, it's a lot of a physical and mental toll. So I think more help, as it were, from those groups to kind of help the process along. It's pretty self-willed. It would really be useful. And I think one just has to kind of recognize that in today's world, you know, building a house is not the village coming around and all helping on the scaffolding, you know, like we see with sort of Amish communities where there's suddenly 60 people. It must have been like that once upon a time. So it is a huge sort of personal and almost solo labor of love to some extent, you know, with a partner or wife or husband or small family. And there's only so much with the way we have constructed our society that friends and family can do, because they'll have jobs and everything else. So one just has to recognize that it's a big commitment. You're going to focus on the most important things, which is finishing the job and getting in, and that the nuance of living building, whilst an amazing, wonderful resource book, and there's a huge online forum of people that have done it across in America, etc., is fabulous. It's like in the self-build world, I can't see it for now being this thing that's suddenly going to explode, because you do have to be exceptionally committed to achieve all of the targets.
Well, Toby, thank you so much for showing me the house and for chatting to me. Really appreciate your time.
Anytime. Thanks for coming.
Get more in our show notes. notes, which you can find today at houseplanninghelp.com/369. You can review the key points. Once again, we always provide a summary with each podcast. You can take a look at some photos as well, this lovely building as it goes through construction to completion. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. That's the place to leave your comment. Or, of course, as we do these days, social media of your choice. We'll link those in too. And an important link to Dig & Co. houseplanninghelp.com/369. My call to action is to check out the Hub. And we've helped hundreds of self-builders and renovators over the years. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing someone wave goodbye because they've got a fantastic home now and they've had quite enough of building. But if you're in your early stages and you want a helping hand and just it's a fun thing if you've got some time, because really you need to be on a tablet, on a computer where you can just log in and get involved in some of the content. That's when it works best, when you're happy to put the time in, whether it's checking one of our Ask the Expert sessions, whether you want to do that in real time or after the session is recorded and just flick through the questions, the courses. It could be interacting in the forum with others, tapping into what they have learnt. Maybe it's what I've learnt. You can chat to me. Each week we've got an opportunity. It's called Office Hour. We start the week like that. There are in-depth video case studies where we follow complete projects so that you can just get your head around what does that mean to do a retrofit or what does that mean to do a new build, and live training with guest experts. We are trying to prep you up. Get on board today. houseplanninghelp.com/join to find out more. Next time, mechanical engineer Florence Collier from Humblebee is my guest, and we're going to be looking at where the money goes on a retrofit. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.